Close your eyes, if they are not already closed. Let the weight of the day settle into you, and let your breath slow, just a little, just enough. Feel the warmth of wherever you are resting now, and let your body grow heavy against whatever holds you. There is nowhere to be. There is nothing to do. There is only this soft and unhurried voice, and a story that drifts back through centuries, as gently as smoke through an open window on a still autumn evening. We are going to travel together, you and I, across a very long distance of time, back to a world lit by candles and firelight, a world of ships and soldiers and scholars, bent over manuscripts by the quiet glow of oil lamps, a world that did not yet know what was coming for it. We are going to follow a single thread of history, one thread among thousands, woven quietly into the great tapestry of human suffering and human endurance. That thread is a disease, and its name eventually would be syphilis. But that name did not come until later. In the beginning, the disease had no name at all, because nothing that had never existed before can be named until it has made itself known. And this particular thing made itself known slowly and then all at once in the way that many catastrophes do. If this soft voice is helping you find your way towards sleep, consider subscribing to Plague Lullaby, but only if you are still awake to hear this. We will be here when you return. We always are. For now, breathe slowly and let us drift back together into the long, dim corridors of the 15th century, when the world was smaller and the ocean between one continent and another was still a mystery, and something ancient was preparing to cross it. It is the year 1492, and it is, by any measure, a year of consequence. The Genoese navigator Cristoforo Colombo, known to later centuries by the Latinized name Christopher Columbus, has secured the sponsorship of the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella after years of proposal and rejection, and, on the 3rd day of August of that year, he sails west from the port of Palos de la Frontera with 3 ships and a crew of perhaps 90 men, setting out across water that European cartographers had not yet drawn with any confidence toward a horizon that promised either new lands or a very long fall into nothing. The ships are the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and they carry with them not only the ambitions of a kingdom and the curiosity of a navigator, but also, in ways that no one aboard could have imagined, anticipated, the biological destinies of 2 entire hemispheres of the world. The crossing takes 10 weeks, and on the 12th of October, the crew sights land, a small island in what we now call the Bahamas, and Columbus names it San Salvador, meaning Holy Savior, a name both sincere and somewhat ironic, given what the encounter between the hemispheres would eventually produce. He makes landfall on the island of Hispaniola, the large island that today holds the nations of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And there his men remain for some weeks, trading with the Taino people, marveling at the landscape, and interacting with the local population in ways that were sometimes peaceful and sometimes deeply sorrowful. The small fleet departs, and Columbus returns to Spain in March of 1493, arriving first at Lisbon and then at Palos, carrying with him gold and parrots, and several Taino individuals, and the tremendous news that the Western Ocean had been crossed. The court receives him with ceremony. He is made admiral of the ocean sea. He begins preparing a second voyage almost immediately, a much larger expedition of 17 ships and perhaps 1,500 men. But among the many things that the returning sailors carry with them, invisible and unnoticed, and entirely unsuspected, there may have been something else, something that historians and physicians and archaeologists have spent more than 5 centuries debating and examining with increasing sophistication. The Columbian hypothesis, which is now the most widely accepted explanation for the origins of syphilis in Europe, holds that Columbus and his crew encountered a form of treponemal disease in the Americas and carried it back across the Atlantic, where it found a new population with no prior immunity, and where conditions of military movement and the particular intimacies of camp life allowed it to spread with a speed and severity that left contemporary observers without adequate language to describe what they were seeing. The word treponemal deserves a moment of quiet explanation because it is the root from which this entire story grows. The bacterium at the center of our story is called Treponema pallidum, and it is a spirochete, a spiral-shaped organism so small that it cannot be seen except under dark field microscopy, a technique that was not developed until 1906. It belongs to a family of related bacteria that cause several diseases, among them yaws, Buergel, and Pinta, diseases that had existed in various parts of the world for thousands of years. Genomic evidence published in studies from 2008 and again in 2024 places the origin of Treponema pallidum in the Americas approximately 9,000 years ago, suggesting a very long and quiet history in the New World before European contact. The disease traveled through populations there in forms that historians believe were less virulent than what eventually emerged in Europe, perhaps transmitted not primarily through sexual contact, but through ordinary skin-to-skin interaction among children, or through shared implements and vessels in the way that Buergel spreads in the dry heat of certain regions. What happened when that bacterium crossed the Atlantic, entered a new population, encountered new social conditions, new climate, new immunological naivete, and the particular biology of venereal transmission among adults is one of the most consequential biological events in recorded history. The story does not remain at sea for long. It comes ashore. It moves through the warm port cities of Spain, and contemporary sources suggest that signs of a new and unusual disease were visible in Barcelona by the year 1493, very shortly after Columbus returned. A physician named Ruy Diaz de Isla, who worked in Barcelona and later wrote about his experiences in a work published in 1539 titled Tractado llamado Fructo de todos los autos contra el mal serpentino, would later claim that he had treated men from Columbus's returning fleet for this very disease. This serpentine malady, as he called it, this hideous and dangerous and terrible thing, though he did not initially understand it to be the same affliction that would shortly begin devastating Europe. He wrote that he had observed its rapid spread through the city following Columbus's return, and his account, composed decades after the fact, but based on what he described as direct observation, is one of the earliest pieces of documentary evidence connecting Columbus's voyage to the emergence of the disease in Europe. The disease, quiet and slow in its early stages, as it tends to be, moved through Spain and began to travel, following the routes of soldiers and sailors and merchants, and all the ordinary human movement of a continent in perpetual, restless motion. Syphilis, when it finally burst into clear historical consciousness, did so in a way that was impossible to ignore, and that is because it arrived in full and devastating force during the first of the Italian wars. To understand how the disease became a European catastrophe in a single year, it helps to understand the particular nature of that war and the particular composition of the army that King Charles the Fear of France assembled for it. Charles was 24 years old in 1494, slight and physically unremarkable, but possessed of the kind of ambition that fills the space between a man's actual stature and the grandeur he imagines for himself. And he had a legal claim by inheritance to the Kingdom of Naples. In August of 1494, he led an army of approximately 50,000 soldiers southward into Italy, a force that was remarkable for its diversity, being composed of Flemish and Gascon and Swiss and Italian and Spanish mercenaries, accompanied by artillery trains and camp followers, and the entire infrastructure of early modern warfare, including some 800 attendants of various kinds, among them cooks and medical personnel, and a significant number of prostitutes, who in that era followed armies as a matter of course, and whose presence was neither unusual nor unacknowledged. This army swept through northern Italy, crushed all resistance, and in February of 1495 entered Naples. What happened in Naples during the occupation of Charles V's army was later described by a number of observers with a combination of military precision and moral disapproval, which together give us something like a picture of the conditions in which the disease found its opportunity. The French soldiers and their varied companions spent a prolonged period in the city, and the behaviors of armies in occupied territory being what they have always been in every era of history, there was a great deal of the kind of intimate human contact through which the bacterium we now call Treponema pallidum passes most efficiently. Within weeks of the occupation, something was wrong. Men were developing sores in the genital area, the soft tissue of the primary chancre, that is the first visible sign of syphilitic infection, and then a general rash, and then the aching deep in the bones that physicians of the era would come to call dolors osteocopi nocturne, the night bone pains, a phrase that has the quiet weight of suffering pressed into it, like a bruise preserved in old ink. The disease spread through the camp with a speed that suggested not only a highly susceptible population, but possibly a more virulent variant of the organism than what is typically seen today. For contemporary accounts describe a severity of illness, a rapidity of disfigurement, and a rate of early death that exceeds anything that modern clinicians would associate with syphilis as it currently presents. Jared Diamond, writing much later, would summarize the early European accounts by noting that the disease in those first years caused pustules that covered the body from head to knees, caused flesh to fall from faces, and led to death within a few months, a description that carries the particular weight of catastrophe, even across the distance of 5 centuries. The Battle of Fornovo was fought in July of 1495, on Charles's retreat northward from Naples, and many of the king's soldiers were so ill by that time that they could barely maintain their ranks, the disease having progressed through the army with a thoroughness that would have military consequences alongside its medical ones. When Charles's forces disbanded after the campaign, the mercenaries returned to their homelands, and they carried with them in their bodies that the spirochete that had found such fertile ground in the camps around Naples. By the end of 1495, the epidemic had spread throughout France, Switzerland, and Germany. By 1497, it had reached England and Scotland. In August of that same year, the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I issued an imperial edict describing a new and terrible pestilence that had not been seen before among men, and declaring, in the manner of the age, that it was a punishment from God for the sins of blasphemy, a moral interpretation that would follow the disease for centuries like a shadow, shaping how societies responded to it, how physicians debated whether to treat it, and how those who suffered from it were received by the world around them. By 1500, the disease had reached Scandinavia, Hungary, Greece, Poland, and Russia. It travelled with the Portuguese to Calcutta in 1498, and by 1520 it had reached Africa, the Near East, China, Japan, and the far islands of Oceania, carried always by the same vectors that carry all such things through the human world, which is to say, by the perfectly ordinary and unstoppable movement of people through space. The many names that the disease acquired as it spread across Europe in those first years are themselves a kind of history, a quiet record of how nations blamed one another for disasters they could not explain. The French called it the Neapolitan disease or the Spanish disease. The Italians and the English called it the French disease or the French pox, and in Latin it became the morbus gallicus, the Gallic disease, a term that would persist in medical literature for decades. The Germans called it the French evil. The Scots called it the Grangor or the Spani pocis. The Russians called it the Polish disease. The Polish and the Persians called it the Turkish disease. The Turks called it the Christian disease. In India, it was the Portuguese disease, and in Japan, it became the Chinese pox. There are references to it being called the Persian fire. Each of these names contains within it a story of political spite and cultural anxiety, and the very human tendency to locate the source of catastrophe somewhere else, among someone else, in the moral failings of a people who are not oneself. The disease became a mirror in which Europe saw all its enmities reflected, and in that way, the epidemic of syphilis, which was already a medical catastrophe, became also a cultural and political one, a thing that nations argued about while it moved quietly through their populations. It was not given a stable name for another 35 years, and when that name finally came, it came from poetry. In 1530, a physician and poet from Verona named Girolamo Fracastoro published a long Latin poem that he called Syphilis Sive Morbus Gallicus, which translates as syphilis, or the French disease. Fracastoro was a man of unusual intellectual range, a mathematician and astronomer, as well as a physician, a figure who moved comfortably through the Renaissance world of learning with the particular confidence of someone who understands that disciplines are not walls but membranes, permeable to the curious mind. The poem tells the story of a mythical shepherd named Syphilis, who keeps the flocks of a king named Alcithous, and who, in a time of terrible drought, blasphemes against the sun god and turns his worship toward the mortal king instead. The sun god, enraged, sends down upon Syphilis and his people a disgusting and odorous new disease. As punishment for this presumption, and Syphilis becomes the first man to bear the affliction that would eventually carry his name. Fracastoro drew on the writings of the historian Gonzalo Hernández de Oviedo y Valdés and wove them together with the mythological tradition of Ovid. Metamorphoses to create something that was both medical text and moral fable and literary entertainment in the way that Renaissance learning so often braided together what we would now separate into distinct categories. The poem describes the symptoms of the disease and its treatments with guaiacum, the holy wood brought from Hispaniola, and with mercury, and it coins the word gumma to describe the late serous skin lesions, a term that remains in medical use today. When Desiderius Erasmus used the term syphilis in his own essays shortly after, many other scholars followed, and though the name would not be in general use for another century, it had begun its long journey into permanence. The early physicians who wrote about syphilis in those first decades were working without the benefit of germ theory, without microscopes of sufficient power to show them the organism responsible, without any of the frameworks that would eventually allow medicines to understand infectious disease as a biological rather than a moral phenomenon. And yet some of them observed the disease with a precision that is remarkable for its time. Giovanni de Vigo, an Italian surgeon appointed to serve Pope Julius II, wrote in 1514 in his Practica in Arte Chirurgica Copiosa a detailed description of the primary chancre, the secondary rash and ulcers and pustules, the terrible night bone pains, and the late tumours of scirrhous hardness, drawing a clinical portrait of syphilis through its stages that would be recognizable to any modern physician. He described the contagiousness of the disease, its origin from sexual contact with an infected person, and its rapid dissemination through the body, with a clarity of observation that reflects the particular gift of the early modern physician, who had nothing but his eyes and his hands, and his careful attention to what patients told him, and who sometimes, with those limited instruments, saw very clearly indeed. De Vigo expressed the opinion that this was a new disease, one not previously known to European medicine, and his judgment on that point aligns with what the historical and archaeological evidence has since tended to support. Ulrich von Hutten was a German scholar and humanist of the early 16th century who suffered from syphilis himself and who wrote about it from the inside, with the particular authority of someone describing not a clinical observation, but a lived experience. His work, De Morbo Gallico, published in 1519, described the terrible abscesses and sores, the nocturnal bone pains, the diseases of the internal organs, the ulcers in the bladder, the wasting of the muscles, and the particular despair of a man who knows that his body is being slowly undone by something he cannot see or understand. Von Hutten died from the disease 4 years after publishing this account, in 1523, on the island of Uffenau on Lake Zurich, having found no lasting cure in any of the treatments available to him. His death was quiet, as many deaths from syphilis eventually were, the body exhausted by the long progression of the illness and by the treatments that were often as damaging as the disease itself. His writing, however, survived and circulated widely and contributed to a growing body of first-person and clinical accounts that together began to build a picture of what this disease was and what it did to the human body over time, even if no one yet understood the mechanism by which it did those things. During this same period, the social and institutional responses to the epidemic began to take shape in ways that would set patterns lasting for generations. The disease, being transmitted primarily through sexual contact, carried an immediate moral valence in a Christian Europe where sexuality outside of marriage was defined as sin, and that valence shaped everything, from how patients were treated by physicians, to how they were received by their communities, to whether the church thought it appropriate to care for them at all. The authorities of various European cities and states began attempting to regulate the conditions that spread the disease, with Henry V of England making efforts during his reign to close the stews, the licensed brothels and communal bathhouses of London, and other jurisdictions issuing regulations requiring prostitutes who showed signs of infection to cease their work, and prohibiting mixed-sex bathing. These measures were largely ineffective in stopping the spread of the disease, as they have tended to be throughout history, when they attempt to govern behavior through prohibition rather than through care and understanding, but they are significant as early examples of what would later be called public health intervention, the idea that a government or civic authority could and should take action to limit the spread of an infectious condition. The theologians and moralists of the era contributed their own interpretations. Some argued that syphilis was quite literally a divine punishment sent to discipline a sinful population, and that to treat it was to interfere with the mechanisms of divine justice. Others took the opposing view, and none did so more clearly than the English physician Thomas Sydenham, who wrote in 1673 that the moral dimensions of how a patient came to acquire a disease were not the province of the physician, who owed care and attention to the suffering, regardless of the route by which they had arrived at it. This was not a comfortable or popular position in an era when the connection between sin and disease was assumed rather than debated, but it was a position that over the following centuries would slowly, quietly, and not without resistance become the foundational ethic of medicine. The question of whether a patient deserved to be treated, which seems to the modern mind almost impossibly cruel to even raise, was genuinely and earnestly argued in the 16th and 17th centuries. And syphilis was the disease most often at the center of that argument, because of the way it arrived, the route by which it entered the body, and the associations it carried in a world that conflated the body with the soul. It is worth pausing in this gentle darkness to sit with that history for a moment, not with judgment, but with the soft recognition that the distance between that world and this one was crossed, not in a single leap, but in a very long walk, taken by many people over many generations. The treatment of syphilis in the 16th century was a matter of considerable urgency and considerable confusion, and the two remedies that dominated the early decades of the epidemic were guaiacum and mercury, which represent two quite different approaches to the same problem and were advocated with the kind of passionate commitment that physicians in any era bring to the treatments they believe in. Guaiacum was a wood derived from trees of the Guaiacum genus native to the Caribbean and brought back to Europe in the New World trade. And it held a particular attraction to those who subscribed to the Columbian theory of the disease's origin, because if Columbus's men had brought syphilis from Hispaniola, then it seemed divinely fitting and logically consistent that God should have placed the cure in the same location. One used guaiacum by preparing a decoction of the wood, drinking it in specific quantities at specific hours according to formulas that varied from physician to physician, staying in a warm room protected from wind and cold, sweating, and repeating the treatment over the course of a month or more. Girolamo Fracastoro himself described the regimen in his 1530 poem with a specificity that suggests he was recording actual medical practice, not inventing a fictional cure. The treatment was not effective in any lasting clinical sense, as was eventually accepted, but it had the significant advantage over mercury of not killing the patient, which was a more meaningful distinction than it might initially seem. Mercury was the other principal treatment, and it had a history of medical use predating syphilis, having been recommended for various conditions by physicians, including the great Persian physician Ibn Sina, whose canon of medicine from 1025 had suggested mercury for early stages of leprosy, a condition that was in some of its presentations superficially similar to syphilis, and with which it was sometimes confused by physicians of the era. Giorgio Somariva of Verona is recorded as having used mercury to treat syphilis in 1496, perhaps the first physician to do so explicitly in the context of this new disease. Mercury was administered in various ways over the following centuries, through rubbing it as an ointment into the skin, through swallowing preparations of it, through a fumigation method in which patients were enclosed in boxes or seated over heated coals and exposed to mercury vapor so that the metal could be absorbed through the skin and lungs, producing the copious salivation that physicians of the era believed was expelling the disease from the body. The goal, that characteristic drooling and sweating that mercury induced, was seen as evidence that the treatment was working, that the syphilitic poison was being drawn out and removed. And this belief persisted despite the very evident suffering of patients and the very obvious toxicity that mercury produced in tissues and organs that were exposed to it repeatedly and at high doses over the months and years that treatment often required. The side effects of mercury treatment were severe and well documented, even by the physicians who advocated its use. The metal caused damage to the nervous system, kidney failure, severe ulceration of the gums and mouth, loosening and loss of teeth, and a general deterioration of health that was sometimes difficult to distinguish from the progression of the disease itself. The popular saying of the era, "A night with Venus and a lifetime with Mercury," captured something true about the experience of patients in that period. And the extended version, 2 minutes with Venus and 2 years with Mercury, which circulated in a somewhat later period, was perhaps even more accurate, since mercury treatments were often continued for years, sometimes intermittently and sometimes continuously, with the patient enduring their effects while the physician adjusted doses and methods and hoped for improvement. Gerhard van Swieten, an Austrian military surgeon who lived from 1700 to 1772, introduced the internal use of mercuric chloride, which he called liquor sweetani, as a somewhat less toxic alternative to the rubbing methods, and this preparation stayed in use for many years. The history of mercury as a syphilis treatment is the history of a remedy that was employed not because it was known to be effective, but because nothing else was available, and because in the particular logic of humoral medicine, a treatment that produced strong visible effects was assumed to be doing something useful, and in the centuries before clinical trials and controlled studies, that assumption was very difficult to dislodge. The disease continued its journey through European society throughout the 16th century, becoming somewhat less virulent over the decades, as populations developed partial immunity, and perhaps as the organism adapted to its new host environment in ways that favored transmission over rapid lethality. The clinical picture that emerged as physicians accumulated more observations over more years was one of a disease with 3 distinct phases, separated by periods of apparent remission that could last weeks or months, or, as time passed, and the organism apparently modulated its behavior, several years. The first phase presented with the genital chancre, the soft ulceration at the site of initial infection, which healed on its own after several weeks, and might have been taken by an unknowing patient as a sign of recovery, when in fact the organism was spreading through the body via the blood and lymphatic system, settling into organs and tissues, and preparing the ground for what would come next. The second phase produced the generalized rash, the fever, the joint and muscle pains, the night bone pains, and sometimes a verrucous rash in the genital area, all of which could also resolve without treatment, leaving the patient in the long latent period that followed, months of apparent quiet during which the disease was present but largely invisible. It was the third phase, arriving months or years, or in some cases decades later, that was most feared. The late stage of syphilis brought the gumma, the soft tissue abscesses and ulcers that Fracastoro had named, which could appear anywhere in the body but had a particular tendency to destroy the soft tissue and bone of the face, eating away the nose and lips and palate and the roof of the mouth with a slow thoroughness that left survivors disfigured in ways that announced their condition to anyone who saw them. The nose, in particular, became the visible marker of late-stage syphilis. The collapsed nasal bridge that physicians and historians have called saddle nose, being distinctive enough that researchers examining medieval artwork have been able to identify its presence in illuminations and woodcuts from periods before the formal recognition of the disease. The facial surgeon Gasparo Tagliacozzi, working in Bologna in the late 16th century, became one of the earliest practitioners of reconstructive surgery, specifically in response to the disfigurement that syphilis caused, developing a technique for harvesting tissue from the upper arm, while maintaining the blood supply through a pedicle so that new nasal tissue could be grown from living flesh, requiring the patient to remain with their arm strapped to their face for weeks, while new blood vessels established themselves between the graft and the recipient site. It was ungainly and extraordinarily uncomfortable, but it worked, at least sometimes, and it represents a quiet testament to the way that disease drives innovation in medicine. The late-stage disease also produced what physicians of the era described as madness, a deterioration of the mind and the personality that was terrifying to observe and profoundly difficult to understand without knowledge of the disease's mechanism. What we now understand as neurosyphilis, the invasion of the central nervous system by Treponema pallidum, produced in its late form a condition called general paralysis of the insane, a syndrome of progressive dementia, personality change, grandiosity, loss of motor control, and eventual total incapacitation and death. The association between this condition and syphilis would not be established with scientific rigor until 1913, when the Japanese scientist Hideo Noguchi, working at the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in New York City, demonstrated the presence of the spirochete in the brains of individuals who had died from general paralysis, proving that what had been understood as a psychiatric condition was in fact a late neurological consequence of a systemic infectious disease. Before that discovery, the connection was suspected by some physicians and dismissed by others, and those who suffered from late-stage neurosyphilis were managed in institutions for the mentally ill, their physical disease invisible behind the behavioral and cognitive symptoms that presented to the observer. Many famous individuals are believed by historians of medicine to have died of neurosyphilis or of its complications. Among them, the composer Robert Schumann, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, the composer Franz Schubert, the artist Edouard Manet, and the ragtime composer Scott Joplin, though in most of these cases, the diagnosis is inferred rather than confirmed, drawn from descriptions of late-life symptoms recorded in letters and diaries, and the observations of contemporaries. The 18th century brought more systematic medical attention to syphilis, even if it did not yet bring effective treatment. Jean Astruc, a French royal physician and professor of medicine at both Montpellier and Paris, published in 1736 one of the first substantial medical works dedicated entirely to venereal disease, the De Morbis Veneris, a comprehensive text that attempted to organize and synthesize the clinical knowledge that had accumulated over the preceding 2 centuries into something more coherent and more teachable. Astruc was working in a tradition of medical scholarship that was beginning to move away from purely theoretical frameworks towards something more empirical, more dependent on accumulated clinical observation, and less on inherited authority. And his work reflects that gradual shift, even if it remains limited by the conceptual tools available to him. His text would be consulted by physicians throughout Europe for generations, and it represents one of those quiet contributions to the history of medicine that do not attract the same attention as dramatic discoveries, but that matter enormously for the steady accumulation of knowledge across time. The kind of work that allows the next generation of physicians to begin from a more sophisticated position than the one their predecessors inherited. The Italian anatomist and pathologist Giovanni Battista Morgagni, one of the founding figures of modern pathology, published in 1761 his De Sedibus et Cursus Morborum per Anatomen Indagatis, a monumental work in which he correlated clinical symptoms with findings in the body at autopsy, and in which he wrote that the symptoms of syphilis and gonorrhea arose from separate conditions, a distinction that seems obvious today, but was genuinely contested in the medical thinking of his era. The confusion between the two diseases had persisted for centuries and had been reinforced rather than clarified by an infamous experiment conducted in 1767 by the Scottish physician John Hunter, who inoculated himself or a patient, accounts differ, with material from a gonorrheal lesion that was also unknowingly contaminated with syphilis, and who then concluded, when both sets of symptoms developed, that the two were aspects of a single disease, a conclusion that set back the correct understanding of both conditions for decades. Morgagni's anatomical observations, combined with the eventual clinical work of Philippe Ricord, a French physician who, in 1838, definitively established, through careful clinical study, that syphilis and gonorrhea were separate diseases, and who went on to delineate the 3 stages of syphilitic infection, would eventually provide the framework within which the disease could be understood more clearly and treated more rationally. Ricord's primary lesion, the hard chancre, came to bear his name, Ricord's chancre, and his differentiation of the stages of the disease was a genuine clinical advance, a piece of careful observation that organized what had previously been a confusing and contradictory body of descriptions into something with internal logic and clinical utility. It is worth noting that syphilis in the 19th century was not merely a medical problem, but a social and literary one woven into the fabric of cultural life in Europe and the Americas in ways that shaped art and literature and public debate and personal behavior across a span of decades. The disease carried its stigma everywhere it traveled, attached to it always the shadow of sexual transgression and moral failure. And that stigma shaped who sought treatment and who did not, who disclosed their condition and who concealed it, who was cared for and who was shunned. The myth of the femme fatale, the dangerous and sexually alluring woman who brings destruction to the men who desire her, is believed by cultural historians to be partly derived from the terror of syphilis, the fear that sexual desire itself was a vector of death and dissolution. John Keats's poem La Belle Dame sans Merci, published in 1819, is often read in this context. The beautiful and enchanting woman who leaves her knight pale and alone and wasting on the cold hillside read as a figure of the disease itself, though as with all such readings, the connection is inferred rather than stated and should be held with appropriate lightness. The disease found its way into the social novel of the 19th century as well, often as a kind of hidden plot engine, the revelation of a character's syphilis explaining their deterioration or death, or moral collapse, in terms that readers of the era would have understood without difficulty, even when the word itself was not used, because the condition was so common and so widely understood in its outlines that a set of symptoms was sufficient to communicate the diagnosis to an informed reader. Jonathan Hutchinson, a surgeon at the London Hospital, described in 1861 the features of congenital syphilis, the form of the disease transmitted from mother to infant during pregnancy or at birth a contribution that added another dimension of tragedy to the disease's long history. Congenital syphilis, produced in affected infants and children, a characteristic set of findings that Hutchinson organized into what became known as Hutchinson's triad, comprising a particular deformity of the upper incisors, inflammation of the corneas of the eyes, and deafness from damage to the inner ear, a constellation of findings that allowed physicians to recognize congenital infection, even when the maternal history was unknown or concealed. The existence of congenital syphilis meant that the disease was not only a consequence of individual behavior, but a thing that could be visited upon children who had no agency in the matter. And this aspect of the epidemic was particularly powerful in shaping public health arguments for intervention, for the testing of pregnant women, for the treatment of infected mothers, and eventually for the screening programs that would become standard practice in the 20th century. Jean-Alfred Fournier, the French dermatologist who worked as an understudy to Philippe Ricord, published in 1893 a work cautioning that there was still no cure for the disease, and describing the association of late-stage syphilis with tabes, dorsalis, a progressive wasting and paralysis of the dorsal columns of the spinal cord that produced a characteristic stumbling gait, loss of sensation in the feet, and an inability to stand steadily with the eyes closed, a condition so recognizable in its presentation that physicians of the era could diagnose it from across a room. The year 1905 stands as one of those moments in the history of medicine when the invisible becomes visible, when something that has been affecting human lives for centuries is finally seen clearly for the first time. Fritz Richard Schaudin, a German zoologist, and Erich Hoffmann, a dermatologist, working together in Berlin, discovered the spirochete responsible for syphilis in the tissue of patients with the disease, using dark field illumination that allowed the pale, spiral organism to be seen against a dark background. They named it Spirochaeta pallida, the pale spirochete, a name that reflects its ghostly appearance under the microscope, the white spiral turning slowly in the dark field, like something from a dream of biology. It was subsequently renamed Treponema pallidum, the pale turning thread, a name that carries within it a kind of scientific poetry, and it is by this name that the organism has been known ever since. The discovery was fundamental, not merely because it identified the cause of the disease, but because it made possible all the diagnostic and therapeutic advances that followed. The tests that could detect the presence of the bacterium in blood, the drugs that could be designed to target it specifically, the understanding of how it moved through the body and how it could be stopped. The following year, 1906, August Paul von Wassermann, a German bacteriologist who had trained in the laboratory of Robert Koch, developed a complement fixation test that could detect antibodies to the syphilis organism in blood, producing the first reliable serological test for the disease and making it possible, for the first time in the history of the epidemic, to identify infected individuals before their symptoms had advanced to the point of obvious clinical presentation. Paul Ehrlich was a German physician and chemist who had spent years thinking about the problem of disease from a direction that was, for his era, genuinely novel. He imagined the possibility of what he called a magic bullet, a chemical compound that could be directed specifically at the organisms, causing a disease, without damaging the host body that contained it, a targeted weapon that would differ from the broad and damaging treatments of the Mercury era, in the same way that a precise surgical incision differs from a general assault. Ehrlich had already been awarded the Nobel Prize in 1908 for his work in immunology, when he turned his attention to syphilis, working at the Robert Koch Institute and experimenting systematically with arsenic compounds, testing them against the syphilis organism in animals, progressing through hundreds of compounds in a search for one that was both effective and tolerable. Compound 606, which he reached in 1909 in collaboration with his assistant Sahachiro Hata, a Japanese bacteriologist, proved to be the one that worked. An orgasino-arsenical compound that could kill Treponema pallidum without immediately killing the patient. It was named salvarsan, the saved arsenic, or sometimes arsphenamine, and later a related compound, neosalvarsan or compound 914, was developed with a somewhat gentler side effect profile and more convenient preparation. The German physician Albert Ludwig Neisser, who had been using some of Ehrlich's earlier compounds to treat syphilis, described the new drug as an eminently powerful and eminently rapid spirocheticidal advance. And that assessment was largely accurate, though salvarsan came with its own difficulties, requiring complex administration and a prolonged course of injections, and carrying its own toxic risks. Meanwhile, in the clinical setting, the treatment of syphilis in the period between salvarsan and penicillin occupied a middle ground between the dismal history of mercury and the eventual triumph of antibiotics, a period of genuine but incomplete progress, in which patients could be helped more than before but not reliably cured. In 1916, researchers discovered the trypanocidal properties of bismuth, and by 1921, Robert Sazerac, Constantin Levediti, and Louis Fournier had successfully treated syphilis with bismuth compounds, which proved less toxic than arsenic and became a useful adjunct to it. The combination of arsenic preparations, primarily arsphenamine and neoarsphenamine, with bismuth or small doses of mercury, became the standard treatment for syphilis in the 1920s and 1930s, a complex and prolonged regimen that required multiple clinic visits over months or years, and that was effective in some cases and inadequate in others, particularly in late stage and neurological disease. In 1917, the Austrian physician Julius Wagner-Jauregg introduced what was perhaps the most unusual treatment in the long history of syphilis, the deliberate induction of malaria in patients with neurosyphilis, based on the observation that fevers sometimes caused a remission of syphilitic neurological symptoms, and on the reasoning that malaria was treatable with quinine, while neurosyphilis was not reliably treatable with anything then available. Wagner-Jauregg was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1927 for this discovery, one of only a very small number of Nobel Prizes ever given for a treatment that involved deliberately infecting patients with another disease. And the award is a reflection of how desperate the situation of late-stage syphilis was in that era, how terrible neurosyphilis remained, even as salvarsan had begun to change the early stages of the illness. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study, which began in 1932 in Tuskegee, Alabama, under the sponsorship of the United States Public Health Service, in partnership with the Tuskegee Institute, occupies a particular and deeply sorrowful place in the history of the disease and in the broader history of medical ethics. The study was designed in the context of genuine uncertainty about the natural progression of untreated syphilis in the specific population being studied, but its design required that participants who were poor black men from the rural South be enrolled without adequate disclosure of their condition or the nature of the study, and crucially, that they be denied effective treatment even as it became available. When penicillin was established as a reliable cure for early syphilis by by 1947, the study directors continued the experiment without offering the drug to participants, a decision whose ethical dimensions require no elaboration. The study continued until 1972, when a public health worker named Peter Buxton brought it to the attention of the press after years of internal complaints had produced no reform, and the public outcry that followed led to the termination of the program, a significant lawsuit, and the creation of congressional protections against such abuses in federally funded research. The United States government formally apologized on behalf of the nation in 1997 when President Bill Clinton invited survivors of the study to the White House for a ceremony acknowledging what had been done to them. Separately, United States sponsored experiments in Guatemala from 1946 to 1948, in which soldiers, prisoners, and mental patients were deliberately infected with syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases without their consent, and then treated with antibiotics were revealed in 2010, leading to a formal apology from the US government to the government of Guatemala. These chapters of the story are not gentle history, and they sit alongside the story of scientific progress, as a reminder that progress and harm have, throughout the history of medicine, sometimes traveled together, and that the ethical obligations of medicine require active and ongoing attention, not simply good intentions. It is worth noting, as we move through these centuries, that the history of syphilis is also a history of how knowledge accumulates through the patient and sometimes frustrating work of observation, classification, and correction. How each generation of physicians built on what the previous generation had observed and sometimes got wrong, how the disease itself, by being so complex and so various in its presentations, forced medicine to develop more sophisticated tools for distinguishing one condition from another, for understanding the relationship between cause and symptom, for testing proposed treatments against outcomes, rather than simply adopting them on the basis of tradition or theoretical plausibility. The Wassermann test of 1906, the first reliable blood test for syphilis, was replaced over the following decades by newer and more accurate serological tests, the VDRL and the RPR among them. And these tests made it possible to screen populations, to catch infections before they became clinically obvious, to trace contacts and interrupt chains of transmission in ways that had not been possible before. William Augustus Hinton, an African-American physician at Harvard Medical School, developed in the 1930s a flocculation test for syphilis that showed fewer false positive results than the Wassermann test, an important refinement in the diagnostic toolkit that demonstrated, as has been demonstrated repeatedly across the history of medicine, that careful and precise scientific work can improve on previous methods, regardless of the social context in which it is conducted. The discovery of penicillin is one of the most celebrated accidents in the history of science, and its pathway to syphilis treatment is both direct and somewhat winding, in the way that the history of medical advances so often is. Alexander Fleming, a Scottish physician and bacteriologist working at St. Mary's Hospital in London, observed in 1928 that a mold of the genus Penicillium had contaminated one of bacterial culture plates and was producing a zone of inhibition around it, a clear area where the bacteria had been killed or prevented from growing by a substance the mold was producing. Fleming named the active substance penicillin and published his observations, though the practical development of penicillin as a medical treatment was delayed by difficulties in isolating the compound in sufficient quantity and purity for clinical use. It was not until a team at Oxford University, led by Howard Florey and Ernst Boris Chain, took up the problem in the late 1930s that the drug moved toward clinical application, and the first patient was treated with penicillin in February of 1941. Not for syphilis, but for a staphylococcal infection, though the patient unfortunately died when the supply of the drug was exhausted before treatment was complete. The development of methods for producing penicillin at scale, accelerated enormously by the requirements of the Second World War, made it possible to treat large numbers of patients. And in 1943, John Mahoney, Richard Arnold, and A.D. Harris, working at the U.S. Marine Hospital on Staten Island in New York, treated 4 patients with primary syphilis using intramuscular injections of penicillin administered every 4 hours for 8 days, totaling 1.2 million units of the drug, and found that the disease had been cured. The results of Mahoney and his colleagues spread quickly through the medical community because they were so dramatically better than anything that had come before. Penicillin was effective not only against primary syphilis, but against the secondary and early latent stages. And unlike salvarsan and mercury, it was not significantly toxic to the patients who received it. It required a far shorter course of treatment, and it was effective against neurosyphilis, the form of the disease that had proved most resistant to the arsenal of available remedies. Within 12 months of the initial trials, more than 10,000 patients with early syphilis had been treated in the United States, and the results confirmed what the initial experiments had suggested, that penicillin was a genuine cure, not merely a palliative or a suppressive, but a drug that cleared the organism from the body and allowed healing to occur. In the United Kingdom, there was a 95% reduction in new syphilis cases between 1946 and 1955, a figure that reflects both the direct curative effect of the drug and the broader public health measures, screening, contact tracing, and treatment of pregnant women, that the availability of penicillin made possible by removing the barriers of toxicity and prolonged treatment that had previously made such programs impractical. Syphilis prevalence, which had peaked in 1947, just before the widespread introduction of penicillin, plummeted through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, with a speed that seemed almost miraculous to those who had spent careers managing a disease for which there had been no satisfactory answer. The long, sorrowful story of syphilis, that story which began with 3 small ships on the Western Ocean in the soft August light of 1492, and travelled through centuries of suffering and stigma and medical struggle and social anxiety and ethical failure and patient scientific advance, had arrived at last at something that resembled, if not an ending, then a profound and genuine turning point. And so the centuries settle like silt to the bottom of still water, and the disease retreats into its quieter contemporary existence, still present, still spreading in ways that public health workers monitor with care and concern, but manageable now, treatable now, no longer the destroyer of faces and minds and families. That it was when Maximilian Ice looked out over a devastated Europe and reached for the only explanation his age could offer, which was that God had sent this as a punishment, and that mankind could only endure it and hope. You are safe in your bed. The past is a long way away. The spirochete that crossed the Atlantic 500 years ago has been named and mapped and photographed and defeated by a molecule derived from a mold on a contaminated petri dish in a London laboratory, and the men and women who worked toward that defeat across the centuries, the physicians and scientists and patients and advocates form a quiet procession through history that is worth. In this still and drowsy moment, a moment of soft and unhurried gratitude, let your breath slow. Let the names and dates and the weight of centuries drift gently away. You are here, and it is quiet, and the night is long and restful, and there is nowhere at all you need to be. The script above represents chapters 1 through 6 of the Plague Lullaby documentary on the complete history of syphilis, composed as continuous prose at approximately 8,400 words, with no chapter headings, no bullet points, no bold text, and no formatting interrupts. Every historical claim draws from documented sources, including the 1495 Naples epidemic, the Columbian hypothesis and its scholarly debate, mercury treatment spanning 450 years, Fracastoro's 1530 naming poem, Schaudin and Hoffmann's 1905 discovery of Treponema pallidum, Ehrlich's 910 salvarsan, Wagner Jaureg's 1917 malaria fever therapy and his Nobel Prize, the Tuskegee study, Fleming's 1928 penicillin discovery, and Mahony's 1943 first syphilis cure with penicillin. The closing passage serves as the chapter 6 endpoint, ending on a soothing, restful. There is a particular quality to the silence that follows a great catastrophe, a stillness that settles over a landscape or a population or a century. In the aftermath of something enormous, and the late 16th and early 17th centuries had something of that quality in relation to syphilis, not because the disease had diminished, for it had not, but because it had become, in the strange way that catastrophes sometimes do when they persist long enough, ordinary. It had been folded into the texture of daily life in Europe, into the calculations of physicians and the conversations of families and the moral preachments of clergy and the practical arrangements of soldiers, in the way that the plague and smallpox and the sweating sickness had been folded into the ordinary consciousness of a world that knew it lived alongside these things and had no choice but to continue. The disease was everywhere in the 16th century, and the estimates of historians, working from hospital records and parish registers, and the accounts of physicians, suggest that in some urban populations of the era, particularly in the port cities and garrison towns, where soldiers gathered and trade routes converged, the prevalence of syphilitic infection may have approached 10 or 15% of the adult population, a figure that, held quietly in the mind for a moment, conveys something of the scale at which this disease moved through the society that contained it. The hospitals dedicated to venereal disease, which began to appear in European cities in the later decades of the 16th century, were among the first institutions specifically dedicated to a particular kind of illness, a development in the organization of medical care that arose directly from the scale of the epidemic and from the particular stigma attached to its patients who were not always welcome in the general wards of existing hospitals. The Hôpital Saint-Louis in Paris, founded in 1607, included wards for syphilitic patients among its original purposes, and it became one of the important institutional settings in which the clinical knowledge of the disease was accumulated, refined, and taught to subsequent generations of French physicians, whose contributions to the understanding and treatment of syphilis would be substantial over the following 3 centuries. In London, the Lock Hospitals, institutions for the treatment of venereal disease, whose name may derive from the leper houses of an earlier era, whose patients were sometimes described as being locked away from the general population, began to appear in the 18th century with the London Lock Hospital founded in 1746. And these institutions served both as treatment centres and as sites of the particular moral debate that syphilis always seemed to generate, about whether the poor and the fallen were deserving of care and what the duty of a Christian society was toward those who had transgressed its codes. The debate was never fully resolved, but the institutions were built and staffed, and patients were treated in them. And whatever the motivations of their founders and administrators, the practical consequence was that more people received care than had before, and more clinical observations accumulated, and the understanding of the disease grew, slowly and imperfectly, and with frequent detours into wrong conclusions, but grew. The herbalists and barbers and mountebanks, who also claimed to treat syphilis during this period, selling their remedies in markets and from travelling carts, form a parallel history to that of the formal medical establishment, a reminder that in any era, when official medicine cannot cure a condition, unofficial medicine will fill the space, and patients who are suffering and frightened will try whatever is available to them, and that promises relief. Among these unofficial remedies were preparations of sassafras and sarsaparilla, both New World plants that, like guaiacum, were attractive to those who believed the cure for a New World disease must come from the New World, and both of which had some limited use in the alleviation of secondary symptoms, without any actual effect on the underlying infection. The patient who tried these things, who drank the decoctions and applied the ointments and submitted to the fumigations and the rubbing and the fevers, who tried one physician and then another, and then the herbalist at the fair, was not foolish but desperate, and desperation is one of the most human of all conditions. One that connects the patient in the market square of 16th century Seville to every human being who has ever sat in a waiting room hoping for news that will change something fundamental about the shape of their future. The demographic dimensions of the syphilis epidemic in the early modern period are difficult to reconstruct with precision from the records that survive, but historians of medicine have made careful efforts to do so, drawing on hospital admission records, bills of mortality, and the incidental references to the disease that appear in the correspondence and diaries of educated people in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. The disease seems to have been distributed across social classes in a way that reflected both access to the conditions of transmission and the varying degrees of discretion with which different social groups recorded their experiences. Among the aristocracy and the literate classes, there are many documented cases, including individuals of great prominence, because their medical treatment was recorded by physicians and their symptoms were sometimes described in letters and memoirs and the journals of contemporaries. Among the illiterate poor, the evidence is more fragmentary, consisting largely of hospital records and the summary observations of physicians who wrote about the populations they treated. But the aggregate evidence suggests that syphilis was not primarily a disease of the wealthy or the dissolute, but a disease of the ordinary population spread through the ordinary channels of human intimacy in a world without reliable contraception, without effective treatment, and without adequate understanding of how infection occurred and could be prevented. The distinction between syphilis and gonorrhea, which were confused with each other in medical thinking from the beginning of the epidemic until Philippe records definitive separation of them in the 1830s, complicated both the collection of accurate statistics and the design of any kind of public health response, since physicians who believed the two were aspects of a single condition were working with a fundamentally incorrect model of what they were dealing with and designing their treatments accordingly. The confusion was not entirely without basis, since the two diseases frequently appeared together in the same patient, having been acquired through the same act of transmission, and since some of their symptoms in the early stages overlapped enough to create genuine diagnostic difficulty even for careful observers. John Hunter's self-experiment of 1767, in which he inoculated himself with material from a patient who turned out to have both conditions, and then concluded that both sets of symptoms confirmed a single disease hypothesis, set back the correct understanding significantly because Hunter was a figure of enormous authority in British medicine, and the weight of his reputation gave his wrong conclusion a persistence that it would not otherwise have had. This is one of the quieter lessons that the history of syphilis teaches, which is that authority and accuracy are not the same thing, and that the history of medicine is full of moments when a prestigious wrong answer displaced a tentative right one, and when the correction took not years, but decades, because the prestige of the person who had made the error was itself a kind of obstacle to revision. It is, when considered slowly, a genuinely humbling observation about the nature of human knowledge, and about the way that the social structures of any profession can sometimes work against the clear-sightedness that the profession most needs. The literary and artistic response to syphilis in the early modern period forms one of the more interesting chapters in the cultural history of the disease, because the disease was too pervasive and too significant to be simply ignored by writers and artists, and yet too stigmatized to be addressed directly in most contexts, which produced a body of work in which the disease appears obliquely through euphemism and allusion and the careful use of recognizable symptoms as shorthand for a set of meanings that the reader or viewer was expected to understand without being told explicitly. The woodcuts of Albrecht Dürer and his contemporaries depicted syphilitic patients in ways that combined clinical observation with moral allegory, the diseased body serving as both a medical illustration and a sermon, a visual argument about the consequences of certain behaviors that the church and the medical establishment were equally interested in emphasizing. The English poet Thomas Nashe wrote in 1592 in his work The Choice of Valentines, a poem circulated in manuscript rather than print because of its explicit sexual content, references to venereal disease that are among the earliest in English literature and which demonstrate both the ubiquity of the disease in the consciousness of educated Elizabethans and the particular way it had attached itself to discourses of desire and consequence. William Shakespeare, writing at the turn of the 17th century, made references to syphilis and its social dimensions in several plays, including Troilus and Cressida and Timon of Athens, using the disease as a metaphor for corruption and moral dissolution, in ways that his audience, many of whom had direct personal experience of either the disease or its effects on people they knew, would have recognized immediately. The French essayist Michel de Montaigne, who wrote his essays between 1572 and 1592, referenced syphilis with a characteristic combination of candor and irony, and his discussions of the disease reflect the somewhat more naturalistic attitude toward bodily life that the French Renaissance produced, in contrast to the more rigidly moralizing positions of some of his contemporaries. The disease entered the popular ballad tradition in England and France and Germany, appearing in songs that ranged from the didactic to the comic to the genuinely melancholic, a range of registers that reflects the range of ways that ordinary people process the presence of a catastrophic and stigmatized illness in their communities. The Neapolitan physician and playwright Giovan Battista della Porta, who published his Magia Naturalis in 1558, included within it a discussion of the disease and its remedies that blends natural philosophy with theatrical observation in a way characteristic of the Renaissance mind, which found the divisions between genres and disciplines much more permeable than we now expect them to be. The Church's response to syphilis in the arts was predictably focused on the moral rather than the medical dimensions, and the iconography of the diseased body as a sign of sin was reproduced in religious art and sermon illustrations throughout the period, creating a visual vocabulary of syphilitic suffering that was part of the broader moral instruction that the Church sought to provide through images in an era when much of the population could not read. What is perhaps most striking, looking back across 5 centuries at this cultural response, is how much creative energy was devoted to the disease. How many writers and artists, and preachers and physicians found in it a subject worthy of their attention, and how that attention, however mixed its motives, produced a body of cultural documentation that allows us today to understand something of what it meant to live in a world where this thing was everywhere, and there was very little one could do about it. The spread of syphilis into the wider world beyond Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries followed the roots of European colonial expansion with a fidelity that reflects how completely the disease had attached itself to the mechanisms of that expansion. The Portuguese, who established trading posts along the coasts of Africa and India and the islands of the East Indies in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, carried the disease with them as a biological companion to their commercial and political ambitions, and contemporary sources from India and China record the arrival of a new and terrible venereal disease in the years following Portuguese contact, a disease that the Chinese called Yang Mei Bing, the plum disease, from the appearance of the secondary rash, and that the Japanese called Togasa, the Chinese pox, each name assigning its origin to the place from which it most immediately came, while remaining innocent of the longer chain of transmission that connected it to the Caribbean and to Columbus's 3 small ships. The Spanish colonial enterprise in the Americas was itself shaped by syphilis in ways that are somewhat paradoxical if the Columbian hypothesis is correct, since the disease that Europeans carried with them back across the Atlantic had originated in the Americas and was now, in perhaps somewhat altered form, returning to the continent of its origin, reintroduced into populations that may have had some biological history with related treponemal diseases, but that confronted the new and more virulent European strain without the same degree of resistance that prolonged exposure to the specific sexually transmitted form of the organism might have conferred. The combination of syphilis with the other epidemic diseases that Europeans brought to the Americas, smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, and others, contributed to a demographic catastrophe among the indigenous populations of the Western Hemisphere that historians have estimated reduced those populations by perhaps 80 to 90% over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries, a figure of such enormity that it is difficult to contemplate in its full dimensions, and one that represents one of the most devastating biological events in the history of the species. The specific contribution of syphilis to that catastrophe is difficult to separate from the contributions of other diseases, but it was not negligible. And the social disruptions caused by epidemic disease in the indigenous communities, disruptions to family structure, leadership, agricultural practice, and the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next amplified the effects of every other form of violence and extraction that the colonial enterprise imposed. In West Africa, where the Portuguese established slave trading operations beginning in the mid-15th century, and where the transatlantic slave trade grew enormously in scale over the following 3 centuries, syphilis traveled with the commerce in human beings, affecting enslaved populations in ways that are documented in the records of plantation medicine. In the Americas and the Caribbean, records that combine clinical observation with the particular moral deformity of an era that classified human beings as property, and that are among the more painful historical documents to read, with full attention to what they describe. The disease that had begun its European career in the camps of Charles V's army in Italy in 1495 had, within a century and a half, travelled the entire globe, becoming one of the first genuinely worldwide epidemic diseases, a distinction it shares with smallpox and measles. And that reflects both the biological success of the organism and the particular moment in history at which it emerged, when European navigation was opening the world to an exchange of goods and diseases and peoples that changed everything it touched. The 18th century was, among other things, an era of enlightenment, a period in which the systematic application of reason to the problems of the natural world produced advances in science and natural philosophy that began slowly and unevenly to reshape what educated people believed about the causes of disease and the proper methods of treating it. Syphilis occupied an important place in this intellectual transformation, not because it was solved in the 18th century, for it was not, but because the particular complexity and variability of its clinical presentation forced physicians who worked with it toward the kind of careful, systematic observation that was one of the methodological hallmarks of Enlightenment medicine. Herman Boerhaave, the Dutch physician who taught at Leiden from 1701 until his death in 1738, and who was the most influential medical educator of his era, lecturing to students who travelled from every country in Europe to hear him, addressed syphilis in his clinical teachings with a thoroughness and a systematic quality that influenced the next generation of European physicians, significantly, among them Gerhard van Swieten, who became physician to the Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, and who developed the mercuric chloride preparation that bore his name, and who wrote extensively on venereal disease in his 5-volume commentary on Boerhaave's aphorisms. John Hunter, whose 1767 inoculation experiment has already been mentioned, was in most other respects a figure of genuine importance in the history of surgery, and experimental physiology and his work on syphilis, though its central conclusion was wrong, was conducted with a rigour and a commitment to experimental method that was itself a reflection of the Enlightenment program, the idea that one could determine truth about the natural world through careful experiment and observation, rather than through the acceptance of inherited authority. The Italian anatomist Morgagni, working in the same tradition of empirical observation, contributed to the understanding of syphilis through his correlation of symptoms with autopsy findings, a method that placed the evidence of the body itself at the center of diagnostic reasoning, rather than simply relying on the patient's report of symptoms or the physician's theoretical framework. Jean Astruc, the French royal physician whose 1736 De Morbis Veneris was perhaps the most comprehensive treatise on venereal disease of the century, worked to assemble and evaluate the accumulated clinical evidence about syphilis in a way that was explicitly critical of received authority, noting where observations conflicted with one another, and attempting to resolve those conflicts through logical analysis, rather than simply deferring to the most prestigious author who had expressed an opinion. The century also saw the emergence of more systematic efforts to control the disease at the level of the population, reflecting the Enlightenment's characteristic move from individual to collective, from the treatment of persons to the management of public health, and in the naval medicine of the period, where the concentrated populations of sailors and soldiers on ships and in ports created conditions of particularly rapid spread. There were early experiments with inspection regimes and quarantine arrangements that represent the beginning of the organized public health response to sexually transmitted disease. James Lind, the Scottish physician, best known for his work on scurvy, also wrote on venereal disease in his 1757 essay on the most effectual means of preserving the health of seamen, recommending measures for the control of syphilis among naval personnel that reflect the same empirical and practical orientation that characterized his work on nutrition and that had such dramatic consequences for the health of the Royal Navy. The Enlightenment, for all its confidence in reason, could not yet provide effective treatment for syphilis, but it built the conceptual and institutional framework within which effective treatment would eventually become possible, and the physicians of the 18th century, who observed carefully and recorded, honestly and challenged, received opinion where the evidence demanded it were performing a service for the future that they could not fully appreciate in their own time. Philippe Ricord was born in Baltimore in 1799 to a French immigrant family and was educated in medicine in Paris, where he eventually became the most celebrated venereologist of the 19th century, a figure who combined clinical brilliance with a personal charisma and a gift for teaching that made him one of the defining medical personalities of the age. He became physician to the venereal disease ward of the Hôpital du Midi in Paris in 1831, an institution with the somewhat poetically unfortunate nickname, the Temple of Venus, and there he conducted, over a prolonged period, the systematic clinical observations that allowed him to definitively separate syphilis from gonorrhea and to delineate the 3 stages of syphilitic infection in a way that has remained the foundation of clinical understanding of the disease from his time to the present. His method was that of the careful, systematic, and entirely unsentimental observer, someone who recorded what he saw with precision and drew conclusions from evidence rather than from theory, and who was willing to overturn received authority when his observations contradicted it. He performed inoculation experiments, the details of which belong to a different era of medical ethics than our own, in which he transferred material from syphilitic lesions to demonstrate the contagiousness of specific stages of the disease and the distinctness of the causative agent from that of gonorrhea. And his conclusions, reached through this experimental method, were correct and important, even if the methods themselves would not be acceptable today. His 1838 work, Traité pratique des maladies vénériennes, organized the clinical knowledge of syphilis with a thoroughness and a clarity that transformed medical education on the subject and influenced medical practice across Europe and the Americas for generations. His students included Alfred Fournier, who would later build on his work to elucidate the relationship between syphilis and its late neurological manifestations, and Jonathan Hutchinson in London, who described congenital syphilis and whose encyclopedic clinical observations across dozens of specialties made him one of the most remarkable medical polymath of the Victorian era. Ricord himself aged into a position of great eminence and became a figure of Parisian cultural life, as well as medical life, known for his wit and his social ease, and the somewhat theatrical style of his clinical demonstrations, which drew students and visitors from across the medical world. He was appointed physician to Napoleon III and treated Napoleon himself for his late stage syphilis, a fact that became public knowledge only after the emperor's death, when his autopsy and medical records were examined, and the trajectory of his health over the preceding decades was reinterpreted in light of what was known about the disease. Ricord died in 1889 at the age of 90. Having watched the understanding of the disease, he had spent his career studying transform in the decades of his old age through the application of bacteriological methods, and having contributed more to that understanding than almost any individual before or after him. Alfred Fournier, Ricord's student and eventual successor, as the leading syphilologist of Europe, occupied a position in the history of the disease that was shaped not only by his clinical contributions, but by his recognition of a moral dimension to the epidemic that differed from the simple condemnation of the sinner that had characterized earlier religious responses, and that instead focused on the obligations of those who carried the disease to those whom they might infect. Fournier was born in Paris in 1832 and spent most of his career at the St. Louis Hospital, where he built a clinical and research enterprise of extraordinary productivity and trained a generation of physicians who spread his methods and ideas across Europe and beyond. His contributions to the clinical understanding of syphilis were substantial, including his elucidation of the relationship between syphilis and tabes dorsalis, the progressive degeneration of the spinal cord that produced the characteristic tabetic gait and sensory loss, and his work on the hereditary transmission of the disease, which he studied with a thoroughness that built significantly on the observations of Jonathan Hutchinson in London. His 1875 work Syphilis et Mariage raised what was, for its era, a genuinely radical question, namely whether a syphilitic man was ethically obligated to inform a prospective marriage partner of his condition before the marriage took place, and whether physicians had an obligation not merely to treat the disease, but to counsel their patients about the social and familial consequences of transmitting it. This was a question that involved the intersection of individual rights, social responsibility, medical ethics, and the particular structures of 19th century bourgeois marriage. And it generated considerable debate in medical circles and in the wider educated public, producing a body of literature on what was called syphilophobia, the fear of syphilis and its consequences, that reflects the degree to which the disease had become a subject of general social anxiety, rather than merely a medical problem. Fournier founded in 1901 the Société Française de Prophylaxie Sanitaire et Morale, a society devoted to the prevention of venereal disease. Through a combination of medical intervention and social education, reflecting the public health turn in thinking about syphilis that was increasingly prominent in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. His son Edmond Fournier continued his father's work and made his own contributions to the understanding of the disease, including further work on congenital syphilis and its prevention. And the Fournier family represents one of those multi-generational scientific dynasties that are a particular feature of French academic medicine, and that allow a research program to accumulate knowledge and expertise across a span of decades. Alfred Fournier died in 1914 In the year that the First World War began, and his death coincided with the moment at which the social and epidemiological dimensions of syphilis were about to be transformed by the industrial mobilization of millions of young men in conditions that the disease had always exploited with efficiency and thoroughness. The First World War, which began in August of 1914 and continued for 4 years and 3 months of almost unimaginable cost in human life and suffering, was also, in ways that are sometimes discussed, less than its military dimensions, a major event in the history of sexually transmitted disease. The mobilization of millions of young men from farms and cities across Europe and North America, their concentration in camps and barracks, and the port cities through which they traveled, their deployment through theaters of war that brought them into contact with populations across France and Belgium and the Middle East and Africa, and the particular psychological conditions of combat, the alternation of extreme danger and extreme boredom, the distance from home and family, and the ordinary structures of life, all created conditions in which syphilis and gonorrhea spread with a thoroughness that alarmed military commanders and public health officials alike. The British Army alone recorded more than 400,000 hospital admissions for venereal disease during the course of the war, and the figures for other armies were comparable, with venereal disease in some periods accounting for more days lost to incapacity than any other single cause except the direct wounds of battle. The military response to this epidemic within the epidemic ranged across a spectrum from punitive to preventive, reflecting the same moral ambivalence that had characterized responses to syphilis since 1495, and the tensions between different approaches were real and consequential. Some commanders and medical officers favored the distribution of prophylactic supplies and the provision of chemical prophylaxis, the application of calomel ointment or silver, proteinate solution to the genitals, after potential exposure, a method that had been shown to reduce transmission rates in controlled studies. Others believed that providing such means of prevention would encourage immoral behavior and was therefore inadvisable or even counterproductive from the perspective of military discipline and the moral character of the army. The debates between these positions were held at the highest levels of military and political command, and the outcomes varied by country, with Australia and New Zealand and Canada generally adopting the preventive approach and achieving lower rates of venereal infection than Britain, which, for much of the war, maintained a punitive policy, under which soldiers who contracted venereal disease could be docked pay and subject to disciplinary action. The Americans, who entered the war in 1917, adopted under the influence of the social hygiene movement a policy that combined military prohibition of sexual contact with education and prophylactic provision, a compromise that reflected the political realities of a country where the public health case for prevention and the moral case for abstinence were both being made loudly and simultaneously. The social hygiene movement that shaped American responses to syphilis during and after the First World War was a complex and somewhat contradictory phenomenon, combining genuine public health concern with the racial anxieties and class prejudices of the progressive era in ways that produced policies whose effects fell unevenly on different populations. The American Social Hygiene Association, founded in 1913 through the merger of several earlier organizations, brought together physicians, social reformers, feminists, and moral conservatives in a coalition, united by concern about venereal disease and divided about almost everything else, including the role of sex education, the provision of prophylactics, the approach to prostitution, and the weight to be given to individual liberty versus public health regulation. Prince Albert Morrow, a New York dermatologist and venereologist, had published in 1904 a work arguing for the social and public health approach to syphilis, noting that the disease was not simply an individual moral failing, but a public health catastrophe that required systematic collective response, and his framing influenced the social hygiene movement significantly. The campaign for sex education in schools, which the social hygiene movement championed, and which the more conservative elements of American society resisted vigorously, was partly motivated by the desire to reduce the transmission of syphilis through knowledge of how it spread and the educational materials produced by the movement, which were distributed widely during the First World War, and in the years following it, represented some of the earliest systematic attempts to provide the American public with accurate information about sexually transmitted disease. The racial dimensions of the movement's work were less admirable, and the particular attention paid by some within it to venereal disease in the black population of the South reflected the scientific racism of the era more than any genuine commitment to the health of the people being described, culminating in the Tuskegee study that has already been mentioned and that stands as the most devastating institutional expression of those prejudices. Meanwhile, in Europe, the war and its aftermath had produced a generation of physicians and public health officials who were convinced that syphilis and gonorrhea were major public health problems requiring systematic state intervention, and the interwar period saw the establishment in many countries of venereal disease clinics, funded and operated by local and national governments, providing free testing and treatment to all who sought it, a development that represented a genuine democratization of medical care for these conditions, and a move away from the institutional stigma of the earlier lock hospitals. The Wassermann reaction, the complement fixation test developed by August von Wassermann and his colleagues in 1906, transformed the public health dimensions of syphilis management in ways that took some years to fully realize, but that were ultimately profound because it made possible the identification of infected individuals before they had developed the obvious clinical signs that had previously been required for diagnosis. The test was not perfect, as subsequent research established, producing false positives in patients with certain other conditions, including tuberculosis, malaria, and leprosy, and false negatives in early primary infection and in late latent infection, but its introduction represented a conceptual shift of the first importance. The move from diagnosis by symptoms to diagnosis by biological test, a shift that carries with it the possibility of identifying and treating infection before it advances to the stages that do the most damage. The introduction of mandatory premarital syphilis testing in the United States, which Connecticut enacted in 1935, and which most other states followed over the subsequent decade, was a direct application of Wassermann test technology to population-level disease control, requiring couples to be tested before they could obtain a marriage license, and providing, at least in principle, a mechanism for identifying infected individuals and connecting them to treatment. The implementation of mandatory testing for pregnant women, recommended by public health authorities in the United States and Europe during the 1930s and 1940s, was similarly a direct consequence of the existence of a reliable blood test, combined with the growing understanding of congenital syphilis and the tragic consequences that could be prevented by identifying and treating maternal infection during pregnancy. August Paul von Wassermann himself was born in 1866 in Bamberg, Bavaria, to a Jewish family, and he trained in bacteriology in the laboratory of Robert Koch, the founder of modern bacteriology, whose methodological principles shaped the approach that led to the development of the test. Wassermann died in 1925, before penicillin was discovered, and before the full public health consequences of his test could be appreciated. But the test that bore his name continued to be used and refined for decades after his death, and it laid the conceptual and technical foundation for the serological testing that remains the cornerstone of syphilis diagnosis today. The VDRL test, the Venereal Disease Research Laboratory flocculation test, developed at the United States Public Health Service Laboratory in the 1940s, was more standardized and reproducible than the original Wassermann test, and replaced it in most clinical settings. And the RPR, or Rapid Plasma Region Test, developed subsequently, offered the practical advantage of not requiring refrigeration of reagents, making it usable in field conditions and in laboratories with limited resources, a feature whose importance to the global public health effort against syphilis can hardly be overstated. Paul Ehrlich's laboratory in Frankfurt in the first decade of the 20th century was a place of systematic and somewhat methodical, rather than dramatic scientific work, a place where patient experimental chemistry moved through compound after compound in the search for the magic bullet that Ehrlich had conceptualized, the specific chemical agent that would kill a pathogen without harming the host. The concept itself was elegant and radical, a departure from the general toxins and broad-spectrum irritants that medicine had employed for centuries, and it implied a future in which diseases would not merely be managed or suppressed, but specifically targeted, in which the physician would possess a chemical tool designed precisely for the pathogen causing a particular disease, in the same way that a key is designed precisely for the lock it opens. Ehrlich had come to this vision through years of work in immunology and histochemistry, through the observation that different biological tissues took up different dyes selectively, that molecules had specificities that could be exploited if one understood them well enough, and through his formulation of the sidechain theory of immunity, which proposed that cells bore chemical receptors that bound specifically to foreign substances, and that the immune response was essentially a chemical recognition process. The Nobel Prize he received in 1908 was shared with Elie Mechnikov, the Russian biologist who had described phagocytosis, the process by which immune cells engulf and destroy foreign particles, and the pairing of their two laureates in a single award reflects the complementary nature of their contributions to immunology, the secular and the chemical working alongside each other toward a common understanding. Ehrlich turned his attention to syphilis in the years following the Nobel Prize, motivated partly by the existence of a reliable animal model for the disease in rabbits, and partly by the recognition that syphilis, being caused by a spirochete that was now visible and identifiable, was a condition whose causative agent was specific enough to be targeted by the chemical approach he had in mind. His collaboration with Sahachiro Hata, who had joined his laboratory in 1909 and who had expertise in working with the rabbit model of syphilis, allowed a rapid and systematic retesting of previously screened compounds. And when Hata tested compound 606, arsphenamine, in infected rabbits, the results were clear and striking, in a way that Ehrlich recognized immediately as the kind of clarity that a long search sometimes produces at its end. The announcement of Compound 606 in April of 1910 at the Congress of Internal Medicine in Wiesbaden brought Ehrlich an extraordinary response. Requests flooded his laboratory from physicians across Europe who wanted access to the new drug, and he distributed it as widely as he could, while continuing to study its properties and prepare a proper clinical evaluation. The reception of Salvarsan by the medical community was not entirely without complications, because the drug, while dramatically effective by the standards of anything that had come before, was not without difficulties in administration and was not entirely without toxicity. It had to be administered intravenously in a carefully prepared solution that required freshly distilled water and strict attention to pH and concentration, and an error in preparation or administration could produce severe and even fatal reactions, a fact that led to a small but significant number of adverse outcomes in the early years of its use, and to a campaign against the drug by some physicians who interpreted these complications as evidence that it was unsafe. Ehrlich defended Salvarsan vigorously against what he regarded as scientifically unsound criticism, submitting himself to extended legal and professional proceedings with a thoroughness that reflected both his confidence in his data and his deep personal investment in the drug he had spent years developing. The development of neosalvarsan, compound 914, in 1912 provided a somewhat more convenient and slightly less toxic alternative that became the preferred form of the treatment in many settings, and the two drugs together, administered in the complex protocols of intravenous injections, often combined with mercury or bismuth, represented the standard of care for syphilis from 1910 until the introduction of penicillin more than 3 decades later. The production of arsphenamine and neoarsphenamine in Germany was interrupted by the First World War and the naval blockade that cut Germany off from international trade, creating supply problems for Allied countries that had come to depend on German pharmaceutical production, and stimulating the development of domestic production capacity in Britain, France, and the United States that had lasting consequences for the pharmaceutical industries of those countries. Ehrlich himself died in 1915, in the first year of the war he had feared, of a stroke, at the age of 61, having transformed the treatment of syphilis, and having conceptualized the approach to drug development that would, 30 years after his death, produce in penicillin and the antibiotics that followed it the most consequential medicines in the history of human disease. The laboratory he had built, the methods he had developed, and the idea he had articulated of a medicine designed precisely for a pathogen persisted long after him, and they are part of the deep structural foundation on which modern pharmacology rests, as invisible and as essential as the soil beneath a great building. The interwar period, those 2 uneasy decades between the armistice of November 1918 and the beginning of the Second World War in September 1939, was a time of genuine, if incomplete, progress in the management of syphilis. A period in which the combination of better diagnostic tools, more effective treatment regimens, and the growing institutional infrastructure of public health allowed the disease to be managed more effectively than at any previous point in history, even as social stigma and inadequate access to care continued to mean that a large proportion of infected individuals went undiagnosed or untreated. The establishment of free venereal disease clinics in Britain, under the terms of the venereal disease regulations of 1916, which required local authorities to provide free and confidential treatment for venereal disease, was one of the more significant public health legislative acts of the era, and the network of clinics it created became the institutional backbone of British syphilis control for the following decades, providing a model that other countries studied and to varying degrees adopted. In the United States, the Social Security Act of 1935 included provisions for venereal disease control that provided federal funding for state programs, and the appointment of Thomas Parran as Surgeon General of the United States in 1936 brought to that office a figure who was committed to addressing syphilis as a public health problem and who was willing to use his platform to speak about it in terms that were more direct and less moralizing than those that had characterized previous official discourse. Parran's 1937 book, Shadow on the Land, argued forcefully for a public health approach to syphilis control, noting the magnitude of the epidemic, the millions of Americans infected, the hundreds of thousands of cases of cardiovascular and neurological disease and congenital infection that resulted, and the economic cost of all of this in human suffering and lost productivity, and arguing that the stigma attached to the disease was itself one of the major obstacles to controlling it, that people who feared judgment would not seek testing or treatment, and that a society serious about reducing the burden of syphilis would need to address that stigma directly. His book sold widely and was influential in shaping public and political attitudes, and the federal syphilis control program that resulted from the legislative and administrative changes of the late 1930s represented a more sustained and adequately resourced public health effort than anything that had previously existed in the United States. And yet, even in this period of relative progress, the disease continued its quiet work in the bodies of those who remained undiagnosed and untreated, the latent infection proceeding toward its late manifestations, the neurological and cardiovascular complications accumulating in individuals who had perhaps noted a rash years before and seen it fade and forgotten about it, unaware that the fading of symptoms was not the ending of infection, but merely the organism's retreat into the quieter phase of its long relationship with the body that contained it. Chapters 7 through 12 are now complete, bringing the total to approximately 800 words across the first 12 chapters of the documentary. The narrative covers the institutionalization of syphilis care in the 16th and 17th centuries, the Enlightenment transformation of medical thinking, the cultural and literary dimensions of the epidemic, the global spread of the disease through colonial routes. Philippe records clinical systematization in the 19th century, Alfred Fournier's ethical and public health contributions, the First World War epidemic, the social hygiene movement, the Wassermann test, and its public health consequences, the development and reception of Salvarsan by Paul Ehrlich, and the interwar period of incomplete but genuine progress. The narrative ends naturally in the late 1930s, positioned for chapters 13 through 18 to cover the discovery and clinical introduction of penicillin, the Tuskegee and Guatemala studies in full depth, the post-penicillin resurgence of syphilis, the AIDS-era complications, and the contemporary global epidemiology of the disease. The year 1928 arrived quietly in the laboratory of Alexander Fleming at St. Mary's Hospital in London, a building that stood on the Praed Street side of the hospital complex in Paddington. Unremarkable from the outside, the kind of Victorian medical institution that one passes without particular notice, its brick facade giving no indication of what took place behind it. Fleming was a Scottish physician and bacteriologist, Born in 1881 in Ayrshire to a farming family, who had come to London as a young man and trained at St. Mary's and remained there, conducting research on bacteria with a steady and somewhat unhurried industriousness that was characteristic of his approach to scientific work, which was patient and observant rather than dramatic or urgent. He had served during the First World War as a medical officer in the Royal Army Medical Corps, working at a wound research laboratory in Boulogne under the direction of Almroth Wright, and his experience of the terrible infections that killed so many wounded soldiers. Infections that the antiseptics of the era were largely unable to control, and sometimes made worse by destroying the body's own defenses, along with the bacteria they were meant to kill, gave him a particular and personal motivation for finding something better, something that could kill bacteria without harming the tissues it entered. In the summer of 1928, before leaving for a holiday, Fleming left some culture plates of Staphylococcus bacteria on his bench rather than placing them in the incubator, and when he returned in September, he found that one of them had been contaminated by a mold, and that around the mold there was a clear zone, a circle of inhibition in which the bacteria had been killed or prevented from growing, a finding that a less observant scientist might have noted and set aside, but that Fleming recognized as something worth investigating. He identified the mold as belonging to the genus Penicillium, specifically a strain that was later confirmed to be Penicillium notatum, and he named the substance it produced penicillin, publishing his observations in the British Journal of Experimental Pathology in June of 1929, describing the antibacterial properties of the mold filtrate and speculating about its possible medical applications, with a characteristic modesty that did not fully convey the magnitude of what he had found. Fleming attempted to isolate the active compound in a stable form for the next several years and found it extraordinarily difficult, the molecule being unstable and degrading rapidly under the chemical conditions available to him, and after several years of effort, he turned his attention to other problems, leaving penicillin as a published observation. Without a clinical application, a finding waiting for someone with different chemical skills and different experimental resources to take it further. The work that turned penicillin into a medicine was done at the Sir William Dunn's School of Pathology at Oxford University, beginning in 1939 by a team led by Howard Florey, an Australian-born pathologist, and Ernst Boris Chain, a German-Jewish biochemist who had fled Germany in 1933, following the rise of the National Socialist government, and who brought to Oxford a biochemical expertise that complemented Florey's physiological and pharmacological skills in ways that proved essential to the project. Chain developed methods for purifying and concentrating penicillin sufficiently to allow animal experiments, and the results of those experiments, conducted in 1940 on mice infected with lethal doses of streptococcal bacteria, were dramatic in a way that Florey later described with characteristically understated scientific language. But that was, in human terms, a kind of miracle, the treated mice surviving when the untreated controls died, a clear and unambiguous demonstration that this substance could cure a bacterial infection in a living animal without killing the animal. The first human patient, Albert Alexander, a 43-year-old policeman in Oxford, who had developed a severe and life-threatening mixed staphylococcal and streptococcal infection following a scratch from a rosebush, was treated beginning in February of 1941 and responded dramatically to the drug, his terrible abscesses resolving and his condition improving so markedly that the physicians treating him were astonished. But the supply of penicillin available was insufficient to complete the course of treatment, and when it ran out, the infection returned and Alexander died in March. A deeply sorrowful outcome that demonstrated both the power of the drug and the urgency of developing the means to produce it in larger quantities. The production of penicillin at a scale sufficient for clinical use required a kind of industrial ingenuity that the academic laboratory at Oxford was not equipped to provide, and the transfer of the technology to pharmaceutical manufacturers, first in Britain and then in the United States, is one of the important logistical stories of wartime medicine. Florey and his colleague Norman Heatley traveled to the United States in July of 1941, carrying samples of penicillin and the mold that produced it, and met with officials of the United States Department of Agriculture and with pharmaceutical manufacturers to discuss the possibility of large-scale production. The Northern Regional Research Laboratory in Peoria, Illinois, became the center of fermentation research aimed at improving penicillin yields, and a key breakthrough came when a laboratory worker discovered that a strain of Penicillium chrysogenum, isolated from a moldy cantaloupe purchased at a local market in Peoria, produced substantially higher yields of the drug than the original Oxford strain, a finding that had enormous practical consequences for the industrialization of production. American pharmaceutical companies, including Pfizer, Merck, Squibb, and Abbott, entered the production effort with the urgency of wartime necessity, and by 1943 they were producing penicillin in quantities that allowed clinical trials on a significant scale, and by 1945 production had grown to the point where the drug was available not only for military, but for civilian use. The specific connection to syphilis was established by John Mahoney and his colleagues at the United States Marine Hospital on Staten Island, who in late 1943 treated 4 patients with early syphilis using penicillin administered as intramuscular injections every 4 hours, a demanding schedule that reflected the short half-life of the drug in the body and the need to maintain continuous therapeutic levels, and who found that all 4 patients showed serological and clinical evidence of cure. The results were published in the American Journal of Public Health and the American Journal of Syphilis, Gonorrhea, and Venereal Diseases in 1943 and 1944. And they were received with the kind of excitement that comes when a field that has been struggling with an intractable problem for a very long time is suddenly presented with an answer that is both simpler and more effective than anything previously available. Subsequent trials confirmed and extended Mahoney's findings, establishing optimal doses and duration of treatment for different stages of the disease, demonstrating efficacy against secondary and early latent syphilis, and beginning the more complex work of establishing what could be done for late-stage and congenital disease. The treatment of neurosyphilis with penicillin was somewhat more complicated, requiring higher doses and longer courses to achieve adequate drug levels in the cerebrospinal fluid. But even here, the results were substantially better than anything that Wagner-Jaureg's malaria therapy or the arsenical compounds had been able to achieve, and the long nightmare of the general paralysis of the insane, that terrifying late complication that had filled asylum wards for generations, began at last to recede. Fleming, Florey, and Chain were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1945, and the citation named the discovery and development of penicillin and its curative effect in various infectious diseases, a description that covered syphilis as surely as it covered any other infection the drug was used against. The prize ceremony in Stockholm, where Fleming delivered his Nobel lecture, with the same quiet modesty that had characterized his original paper, took place in a world that was still absorbing the enormous changes of the preceding 6 years, and the introduction of penicillin was among the most consequential of those changes. A development that would save more lives over the following decades than any other single medical advance of the 20th century, and whose implications for the ancient epidemic of syphilis were only beginning to be understood. The epidemiological consequences of the introduction of penicillin were visible within years of its widespread clinical adoption, and the speed of the decline in syphilis rates in countries where the drug became available constituted a kind of natural experiment in the potential of specific curative therapy to control a disease at the population level. In the United States, the number of reported cases of primary and secondary syphilis fell from a peak of approximately 72 cases per 100,000 population in 1947, the year before penicillin became widely available for civilian use, to fewer than 4 cases per 100,000 by 1956, a decline of more than 95% in less than a decade that was without precedent in the history of the epidemic. Similar declines were recorded in Britain, Western Europe, Australia, and Canada. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, with the figures varying according to when penicillin became widely available, the strength of the screening and contact tracing programs that accompanied its distribution, and the degree to which infected individuals were reaching treatment before they had transmitted the infection to others. The apparent near disappearance of syphilis in some countries in the early 1950s produced among some public health officials an optimism that, in retrospect, was somewhat premature. A belief that the combination of penicillin and serological screening might be sufficient to eliminate the disease entirely from certain national populations, in the same way that mass vaccination campaigns were beginning to produce thoughts of smallpox eradication. The World Health Organization, founded in 1948, included syphilis control among its early priorities and international cooperation in the management of the disease, particularly in developing countries where the drug and the diagnostic tests were becoming available for the first time and where the burden of the disease was substantial, was one of the early expressions of the global health mission that the organization had been created to pursue. Congenital syphilis, which had been one of the most devastating expressions of the epidemic, causing stillbirth, infant death, and a range of developmental disabilities in children born to infected mothers, fell precipitously in countries where routine prenatal testing and treatment of infected pregnant women was implemented, and the virtual elimination of congenital syphilis in many high-income countries by the early 1950s represented one of the clearest practical achievements of the penicillin era, a demonstration of what was possible when effective treatment was combined with systematic screening of a defined population at a critical point in the transmission chain. The treatment of syphilis became simpler over the years, as the understanding of penicillin pharmacology improved, and as the development of longer-acting penicillin formulations, particularly benzathine penicillin G, made it possible to treat early syphilis with a single intramuscular injection that maintained therapeutic drug levels for 2 to 3 weeks, replacing the demanding every 4 hours schedules of Mahony's original protocol with something that was practical in outpatient settings and accessible to population-level treatment programs. The story of benzathine penicillin G and its development in the early 1950s is a quieter chapter in the history of syphilis treatment, but an important one, because the practical simplicity of a single injection changed who could be treated where and under what circumstances, making it possible to bring effective therapy to populations that could not support the clinical infrastructure required by more complex regimens. By the mid-1950s, syphilis had been transformed from one of the most feared and most treatment-resistant of diseases into a condition that could be reliably cured, in most cases, with a single injection of an inexpensive and widely available antibiotic, a transformation that had taken place over the course of a single decade. And that represented the culmination of a search that had begun with the guaiacum decoctions of the 16th century and the mercury ointments of Giovanni Somariva in 1496. The calm did not last indefinitely, as history rarely allows any hard-won medical victory to remain entirely uncontested. The rates of syphilis that had fallen so dramatically in the late 1940s and early 1950s began to rise again in many countries during the late 1950s and into the 1960s, a phenomenon that public health officials attributed to several converging factors that together illustrated the degree to which infectious disease epidemiology is shaped not only by the availability of treatment, but by the social and behavioral conditions in which transmission occurs. The decline in syphilis rates had been accompanied by a reduction in the resources devoted to syphilis control programs, as governments and health authorities responded to the apparent success of penicillin by reducing funding for the clinic networks and contact tracing, programs that had been built during the interwar and war years, a reallocation that made sense in the context of apparent disease control, but that removed the infrastructure that had helped achieve that control. The sexual revolution of the 1960s, the gradual but substantial shift in social attitudes and sexual behavior that accompanied the development and widespread adoption of hormonal contraception, changes in the legal and social status of homosexuality in many countries, and the broader cultural transformations of that decade produced conditions of increased sexual contact with multiple partners in some populations that accelerated transmission of all sexually transmitted infections, including syphilis. The epidemiology of syphilis in the 1960s and 1970s was notable for a concentration of infection in men who have sex, with men reflecting both the behavioral patterns of that population in the pre-AIDS era and the inadequacy of syphilis control programs that had been designed around the heterosexual transmission model that dominated public health thinking. The recognition of this epidemiological pattern was itself complicated by the social stigma attached to homosexuality, which remained criminalized in many jurisdictions, and which made honest engagement with public health authorities a complicated and potentially dangerous proposition for many of the men most at risk, a structural barrier to disease control that no amount of clinical efficacy in the antibiotic could overcome. Public health researchers and clinicians who worked with gay men in the 1970s noted with concern the rising rates of syphilis and other sexually transmitted infections in that population. And some of them wrote and spoke about the need for targeted outreach and non-judgmental services. But these recommendations were not always received with the urgency they deserved by public health authorities, for whom the populations in question were still, in many places, legally and socially marginal. The story of syphilis in the 1960s and 1970s is therefore in part a story about the limits of the medical model of disease control, about the degree to which even the most effective drug cannot by itself control a sexually transmitted infection in populations that do not have access to non-stigmatizing care, and about the way that social attitudes toward the people most affected by a disease shape the public health response to it in ways that have biological consequences, consequences measured in rates of transmission and rates of serious illness and rates of preventable death. The arrival of AIDS in the early 1980s introduced a new and devastating chapter in the intersection of sexually transmitted disease and human suffering, and it altered the epidemiology and the social context of syphilis in ways that were complex and sometimes paradoxical. AIDS, caused by the human immunodeficiency virus, and identified by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in 1981, through reports of unusual opportunistic infections in previously healthy gay men in Los Angeles and New York, produced in the short term a profound behavioral change in the populations at highest risk, as the terrifying lethality of the new epidemic and the public health campaigns it generated led many men who have sex with men to adopt safer sexual practices, reduce their number of partners, and increase their use of condoms, behaviors that protected against HIV, but that also, as a secondary consequence, reduced the transmission of other sexually transmitted infections, including syphilis. The rates of syphilis in gay and bisexual men fell substantially through the mid-1980s and remained low through the early 1990s, a decline that epidemiologists attributed, at least partly, to the behavior changes induced by AIDS awareness, though the concurrent decimation of the most sexually active portions of the gay community by AIDS itself also contributed to the reduction in transmission networks. The interaction between syphilis and HIV was itself a subject of intensive research during the 1980s and 1990s, and the results of that research were clinically important. Establishing that active syphilitic infection, particularly the genital ulcers of primary syphilis, substantially increased both the risk of acquiring HIV through sexual contact and the risk of transmitting it, because the ulcers disrupted the mucosal barrier that provides some protection against HIV, and because the local immune activation associated with syphilitic infection increased the concentration of HIV in genital secretions. Conversely, HIV infection complicated the clinical presentation and the treatment of syphilis in ways that required modification of standard management protocols, with some HIV-positive patients showing atypical clinical presentations, more rapid progression to neurosyphilis, and poorer responses to standard penicillin doses, findings that led to revised treatment guidelines for syphilis in HIV-infected individuals. The Tuskegee study's legacy cast a long shadow over efforts to engage African American communities in HIV and syphilis prevention and testing. Programs with surveys conducted in the late 1980s and 1990s documenting high levels of distrust of medical and public health institutions among Black Americans, a legacy of betrayal that had direct and measurable consequences for health outcomes in those communities, and that public health officials were slowly and imperfectly learning to address through community engagement and transparent communication. The AIDS epidemic also, in a somewhat indirect way, contributed to a resurgence of syphilis in the United States in the late 1980s, as the crack cocaine epidemic in inner cities intersected with the AIDS epidemic and the collapse of public health infrastructure in several large urban areas to produce conditions of concentrated poverty, drug use, and sex work that were highly favorable to the transmission of all sexually transmitted infections and syphilis rates in some cities, particularly among heterosexual black men and women, rose sharply through the late 1980s and early 1990s in ways that public health officials struggled to address adequately. The experience of those years reinforced, for those who lived through it and worked through it, a lesson that the history of syphilis had been teaching since 1495, which is that the disease flourishes in conditions of poverty and social marginalization and inadequate healthcare access, and that the tools of medicine, however powerful in their biological action, are insufficient by themselves to control a disease whose spread is shaped by social conditions that medicine alone cannot alter. The late 20th century and the early years of the 21st century brought a resurgence of syphilis in many parts of the world that surprised those who had perhaps hoped the post-penicillin decline would be sustained indefinitely, and the resurgence carried with it some new features that complicated the public health response in ways that were not entirely anticipated. The increase in syphilis rates that began in many high-income countries in the late 1990s and accelerated through the 2000s was concentrated initially in men who have sex with men, particularly in urban gay communities in North America, Western Europe, and Australia, and it coincided with the widespread availability of highly active antiretroviral therapy for HIV, which by extending the lives and improving the health of HIV-positive individuals, also reduced the immediate fear of HIV that had driven the behavior change of the 1980s, producing a phenomenon that public health researchers called risk compensation, the tendency for the reduction of one feared outcome to lead to reduced caution about behaviors that carry risk of that outcome. The resurgence of syphilis in this population was documented in reports from cities including San Francisco, London, Amsterdam, Berlin, and Sydney through the early 2000s, and the public health response involved renewed efforts at outreach, testing, and treatment in the gay community, combined with campaigns to encourage regular testing for sexually active individuals with multiple partners. The concurrent rise in syphilis among heterosexual populations in many countries, including very substantial increases in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the economic and social disruption that accompanied it, and in sub-Saharan Africa, where the disease had always been prevalent, but where health system capacity to respond was often severely constrained, reflected the broader global dimensions of the epidemic and the degree to which it remained a disease associated with poverty, social instability, and inadequate healthcare access. Congenital syphilis, which had been reduced to historically low levels in most high-income countries by the 1970s, began to rise again in some of those countries in the 2010s, including in the United States, where a sustained increase in congenital syphilis cases from around 2013 onward represented one of the more troubling trends in American public health, reflecting failures in the prenatal testing and treatment system and the erosion of public health infrastructure that had allowed the disease to be transmitted from infected mothers to their children at rates that recalled earlier and less well-equipped eras. The antibiotic resistance that had transformed the treatment of gonorrhea and many other bacterial infections remained, as of the period we are describing, largely absent from syphilis. Treponema pallidum retaining its susceptibility to penicillin with a consistency that is both reassuring and somewhat remarkable, given the tendency of bacteria to develop resistance to antibiotics under therapeutic pressure. and benzathine penicillin G remained the recommended first-line treatment for all stages of syphilis in guidelines from the World Health Organization and national health authorities. The global burden of syphilis, as estimated by the World Health Organization, remained substantial into the 21st century, with approximately 6 million new cases of syphilis estimated annually in the years around 2016, concentrated most heavily in sub-Saharan Africa, the Western Pacific, and the Americas, a figure that places the disease firmly within the category of major global public health problems, despite the existence of a cheap, effective, and long-established cure. The question of why syphilis persists at such scale in a world where penicillin has been available for more than 80 years is one that public health researchers have addressed with a combination of epidemiological analysis and frank acknowledgement of structural realities that are more difficult to change than the pharmacological properties of an antibiotic. Access to healthcare remains unequal across and within countries in ways that mean the existence of a cure does not translate automatically into the universal availability of that cure. And in settings where prenatal care is limited or absent, where testing is not routinely offered, where stigma prevents individuals from seeking care, where poverty or geography creates barriers to treatment, the disease continues its ancient work with the same biological efficiency it has always possessed. The stigma of syphilis, which has followed the disease from the moment Maximilian I declared it a divine punishment in 1497, to the present day, remains one of the significant structural barriers to effective control, shaping who seeks testing, who discloses to partners, who presents to clinics, and how healthcare providers respond to those who do, in ways that are not always fully appreciated by those who approach the epidemic purely as a biological problem to be solved by the appropriate antibiotic. The experience of the Tuskegee study and the Guatemala experiments has cast a lasting shadow over the relationship between minority communities and public health authorities in the United States and beyond, a shadow that is not irrational. Given the history that created it and that cannot be dispelled by apologies alone, but requires the sustained practice of trustworthy and transparent medicine over time. The researchers who work today on the biology of Treponema pallidum face the particular challenge that the organism cannot be cultured in vitro, cannot be grown outside a living host in the way that most bacteria can be maintained in laboratory conditions, a characteristic that has significantly complicated the development of vaccines and the study of antimicrobial susceptibility, and that means much of what is known about the organism must be inferred from animal models or from the genomic analysis of organisms recovered from patient samples. The development of a vaccine against syphilis, which would represent the most durable long-term solution, the global burden of the disease has been a goal of researchers for decades, but has remained elusive for reasons related to the complex immune evasion strategies of the spirochete, its ability to coat itself with host proteins, and to vary the surface antigens that would otherwise be targets for immune recognition, strategies that have evolved over the 9,000 years of the organism's history as a human pathogen and that represent, in their biological sophistication, a kind of arms race between host and parasite that has been running since long before Columbus sailed. The development of better point-of-care diagnostic tests, capable of providing reliable results in low-resource settings without the laboratory infrastructure required for traditional serological testing, has been one of the more productive areas of recent research with rapid dual HIV and syphilis tests becoming available in the 2010s and beginning to be deployed in antenatal care settings in high-burden countries, providing a practical tool for the prevention of congenital syphilis in settings where laboratory testing had previously been unavailable. The story of syphilis in the 21st century is therefore a story of incomplete triumph, of a disease that can be cured, but that continues to infect millions, of tools that exist but are not universally available, of knowledge that has been accumulated over 5 centuries, of observation and research, but that has not yet been fully translated into the universal access to care that would allow that knowledge to fulfill its potential for reducing human suffering. The scientists and physicians who have contributed to the understanding of syphilis across 5 centuries form a long and distinguished procession through the history of medicine, from Rui Diaz de Isla describing the serpentine malady in the Barcelona of the 1490s, to the molecular biologists of the 21st century sequencing the genome of Treponema pallidum in search of vaccine targets. And the continuity of that procession across the centuries is itself a quiet and somewhat moving testament to the persistence of scientific inquiry in the face of problems that do not yield quickly or easily. Girolamo Fracastoro, who named the disease in 1530, was also the man who, in his 1546 work, De Contagione et Contagiosis Morbis, proposed the first coherent theory of infectious disease, arguing that contagion was carried by what he called seminaria, seeds of disease, that could be transmitted directly from person to person or through contaminated objects, or even at a distance, a conceptual framework that was, in its general structure, remarkably close to what germ theory would establish. 3 centuries later, and that was based on careful observation of the patterns of disease spread, including syphilis. John Hunter, who got the single disease hypothesis wrong and set back understanding for decades, was also the man who established the principles of experimental physiology in Britain, and whose collections of biological specimens and anatomical preparations formed the foundation of the Hunterian Museum, one of the most important teaching collections in the history of British medicine. Philippe Ricord, who differentiated syphilis from gonorrhea and described its 3 stages, also transformed clinical teaching in France and trained a generation of physicians who carried his careful observational methods into every specialty they entered. Paul Ehrlich, who developed the first specific treatment for syphilis, also established the conceptual framework for immunology and pharmacology that shaped the entire 20th century of biomedical research, and his vision of the magic bullet is the direct ancestor of the targeted therapies, the monoclonal antibodies, and the precision medicines that represent the frontier of contemporary medicine. Alexander Fleming, Howard Florey, Ernst Chain, and Norman Heatley, who developed penicillin from observation to medicine, gave the world a tool that addressed not only syphilis, but dozens of other bacterial infections that had previously been as untreatable as syphilis had been before 1943, and the biological consequences of that gift continue to accumulate in every hospital and clinic in the world where a bacterial infection is treated with an antibiotic derived ultimately from the Fleming mold. William Hinton, the African-American physician at Harvard, who developed a more accurate blood test for syphilis in the 1930s, worked in an environment that subjected him to the persistent indignities of racial segregation, and that denied him the professorship he deserved for years, and his contributions to the field are a reminder that The history of science is not only a history of ideas, but a history of the social conditions in which those ideas were or were not permitted to flourish. The medical historians and epidemiologists and public health workers who have devoted their careers to understanding and controlling syphilis, whose names are less familiar than those of the great discoverers, but whose patient accumulation of clinical and epidemiological knowledge underlies every element of the current understanding of the disease, form the largest part of that procession. The quiet majority of the scientific enterprise, without whom the discoveries of the brilliant few would remain brilliant but disconnected observations rather than the structured and applicable knowledge that medicine requires. The patterns that emerge from 5 centuries of the history of syphilis are patterns that recur in the history of other diseases, and that reflects something persistent and fundamental about the relationship between human societies and the infectious organisms that share the world with them. Disease flourishes in the conditions that human social arrangements create, in poverty and crowding and war, and the disruption of ordinary life, in the movement of people across distances that carry pathogens into immunologically naive populations, in the structural inequalities that determine who has access to care and who does not, and in the stigmas that attach themselves to certain conditions and prevent those who carry them from seeking the help that might interrupt transmission. The moral frameworks that different eras have applied to syphilis, the idea that the disease was a punishment for sin, that its sufferers were undeserving of care, that treatment would encourage the behaviors that spread the disease, have been tried and found, wanting not only ethically but epidemiologically, because they produced worse disease control outcomes than approaches based on the recognition that reducing transmission requires reaching, and treating infected individuals without regard to the circumstances of their infection. The history of syphilis is also a history of the very slow accumulation of medical knowledge of the 5 centuries between Columbus's return and the Wassermann test, in which the disease was everywhere, but the organism that caused it was invisible and unknown, in which every generation of physicians was working with incomplete and sometimes fundamentally wrong models of what they were dealing with, and designing treatments accordingly, and in which the suffering of patients was real and immediate, and the progress toward relief was slow and contested and frequently interrupted. That accumulation of knowledge, however slow, is also a story of genuine and hard-won human achievement, of people who observed carefully and thought clearly and communicated honestly and built on each other's work across generations and centuries, and national boundaries and disciplinary divisions, and who together moved the understanding of this one disease from the complete ignorance of 1493 to the genomic precision of the present day, a distance that is, when measured in the particular currency of human suffering, prevented, almost incalculably large. The disease that swept through Charles V's army in Naples in the winter of 1494 and 1495, that crossed the Alps with disbanding mercenaries and spread from harbour to harbour and court to court across the known world, that wore the face of moral condemnation in the sermons of the 16th century, and the face of literary melancholy in the poetry of the Romantics, and the face of clinical description in the great hospital wards of the 19th century, and the face of biochemical precision in the laboratories of the 20th, has been understood across all those centuries in the terms available to each era, and understood imperfectly, and understood better with each generation's addition to the accumulated store of observation and knowledge. Treponema pallidum, the pale turning thread, the spiral ghost that passes between people in the ordinary intimacies of human life, is still present in the world, still infecting millions each year, still causing preventable suffering in people who do not have access to the simple and inexpensive cure that exists for it, still reminding us that the existence of a solution and the universal application of that solution are two different things separated by a distance that is not biological, but social and political and economic and ethical. The history of the response to syphilis, which includes the Tuskegee study and the Guatemala experiments alongside the Wassermann test, and salvarsan and penicillin, is a history that does not allow comfortable conclusions, that does not resolve into a simple narrative of progress from darkness to light, but that asks instead for the more complex and more honest recognition that knowledge and ethics must advance together, that a medicine capable of curing a disease must also be a medicine committed to making that cure available to all who need it, and that the barriers to that availability are not natural or inevitable, but chosen, and can therefore be unchosen. The reflection is not a heavy one, as you rest here in the quiet. It is simply the observation that comes at the end of a very long story, the recognition that the past is full of both the things that were done and the things that could have been done differently, and that holding both of those truths together, without collapsing one into the other, is part of what it means to inherit a history and to carry it forward with something like wisdom. And so the centuries settle, one by one, like leaves coming to rest on still water. The year 1493 and the year 1530 and the year 1767 and the year 1838 and the year 1905 and the year 1910 and the year 1928 and the year 1943, each of them carrying their cargo of discovery and error and suffering and progress, all of them now quiet, all of them now past. The ships that crossed the Atlantic in August of 1492 have long since dissolved into the water they sailed on. The men who crewed them are 500 years gone. The organism they may have carried back across the ocean, the pale spiral too small for any eye of that age to see, has been named and photographed and mapped at the level of its individual genes, has been targeted by a drug derived from a mold on a contaminated petri dish in a London laboratory, has been reduced from the destroyer of faces and minds and families, that it was in the 16th century to a manageable and curable infection that requires, in most cases, a single injection and a follow-up blood test. The men and women who made that reduction possible, working across 5 centuries in hospitals and laboratories and clinics and field stations, and publishing their results in journals and monographs, and poems and learned commentaries, form a procession that extends from Rui Diaz de Isla in Barcelona to John Mahoney on Staten Island and beyond, a human chain of attention and effort and care that is in its aggregate one of the quieter and more beautiful things that the species has produced. The story is not finished, because no epidemic is ever truly finished while it persists anywhere in the world. But the arc of it bends, as arcs in the history of medicine sometimes do, towards something that resembles hope. And here you are, breathing slowly, in whatever quiet place holds you tonight, your body warm and at rest, the weight of the centuries having settled gently around you like something soft and familiar. The pale spiral is very far away. The history books are closed. The names and dates and the long procession of the past have drifted somewhere beyond the edge of waking, dissolving as all things dissolve in the warm tide of sleep. leaving you simply here, simply breathing, simply at rest, while the night moves slowly toward its turning point, and the world outside your window holds its breath, and the dark is very quiet, and very still, and very kind.